minutes. I want to keep you on for a little longer and do like a second half to squeeze money out of the people who are watching this, get them to go to Patreon and sign up to see the second half. Do you have another 35, 40 minutes to give? Okay. So we'll talk about the post-left maybe in this section.
Oh, boy.
The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs,
we still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Diet Soap is a Sublation Media podcast. So, Matt Christman is one of the hosts of Chapo Trap House and the man behind the Kush vlog, which I believe premieres on Twitch and then is uploaded to YouTube.
That's correct.
Yeah, he is currently running a reading group on his vlog covering David Graeber and David Wingrove's 2021 book, The Dawn of Everything, a book that revises our understanding of the birth of civilization. And I'm glad to have him back on the podcast. Or I guess, in a way, this is your first visit to the new channel. So, Matt, thanks for coming on. Just to start with, why are you reading the David Graeber book? What's the appeal right now?
Well, I've been finding myself reflecting more and more on foundational questions of human social order and how they came to be, and been trying to figure out for myself sort of a thing that makes sense for me as a narrative for understanding those things. And this book coming out right now, it seemed like a good opportunity to refine my own thoughts by striking them against what Graeber and Wingrove are doing. So, we're pretty early in it. So, but we'll see. We haven't really gotten to the really enervating anarchist parts yet.
Well, back in the 90s, I was an anarchist and living in the Pacific Northwest. And at the time, one of the big trends in anarchism was to be a primitivist.
Oh, yeah.
To turn against
the
agriculture.
First post-left.
Yes, the very first post-left, which we'll talk about the post-left in a bit. If you have some information about it, so you can clarify it for me, I'd really appreciate it, because I have no idea what's going on with the post-left. Yeah, so I would imagine, from what I've heard from you, really, about the Graeber book, so one of the things that he might be doing is overcoming this urge to become a primitivist by saying that it's possible to have agricultural production and even maybe, I don't know, industrial production, or at least some sort of collective work without falling into a hierarchical, oppressive social order.
Yeah, that does seem to be the significant thesis and that is, a challenge to Marxism, certainly. So we'll see how he develops it. But yeah, he's arguing so far that different modes of production do not necessitate certain hierarchical social relationships.
Well, I mean, it may be a challenge to Marxism. To me, it definitely reads like a challenge to primitivism, because the primitivists would say, no, we need to abandon agriculture, get back into the wild, abandon civilization, like they're anti-civilization primitivists in the 90s who would run off into the forest and generally starve to death.
Yeah.
It's a nice book for him to write for his fellow anarchists to, keep them from that fate. But how do you see it as a challenge to Marxism?
Well,
because I think Marxism is like saying, yeah, we can have industrial society, we can have modernity without being hierarchical and oppressive and exploitative. But
a part of Marxism too, though, is the assertion that it is the material relationships that structure our social relationships.
Right.
The chiefest of those is the mode of production.
Right. Okay. Now I get you. Right. So he's saying that no, the mode of production changed, but the social changes didn't start then. They started through some sort of change in ideology.
I mean, we'll
March.
get there. I haven't gotten there yet. We'll see what he says.
Okay. Yeah. My feeling about that is that my knee-jerk Marxist defense against this suggestion is to say, well, the mode of production has to be looked at deeply, and that it's always includes both a social organization and a technological change. So
Yeah.
you might have the development of agriculture without the kind of hierarchical arrangements that would turn that agricultural production into something that sustained larger social orders, and also that was more hierarchical or something like that. But I'm basing that completely off the top of my head, not without thinking it through very much. But I'm always wanting to defend Marxism, especially from the likes of the late David Graeber.
Yes, of course.
All right. So I want to talk about something closer to home, something we both kind of know a little bit about. I know a little bit. You probably know a lot. It's about podcasting and the sort of left space for podcasting. You're at the forefront of that, probably unintentionally. But back in the early days, Chapo Trap House got a big push from the New Yorker. At least that's how I remember it. And last year, you seem to be getting attacked by the New Yorker, or at least
Well, I
criticized.
mean, the first New York article wasn't terribly complimentary. It was sort of a concern troll that we were being insufficiently intersectional. So it's like it was a big deal to be in the New Yorker, and there's this, especially at our point there, any press is good press. It doesn't really matter what they're saying; it just matters they're saying something. But it's
Right.
certainly the angle for it was to see us as sort of defiantly white guys who refuse to accept like the reality of non-class basis of oppression. I mean,
Okay.
gently, but it was certainly not like a, hey, these guys are awesome.
Right. Okay.
But yes, the last one, the most recent one, is certainly more of a direct strike, and that one was very interesting because it shows the trajectory, not just of the relationship between us and the mainstream media or whatever, but just the way that podcasting has become this sine qua non for like political identity, like that. In the absence of any movement on the political front, that consumption of podcasts has become really the stand-in for what your politics are, which that was always part of it. That was always a thing that I think drove attracted people to political podcasts. Is the idea that it would be a way for people who felt political frustrations and the desire for political change to imagine themselves part of a community. But for a while there was a spoken and unspoken sense that was part of a broader project, which I think by now has gone away, and all we're left with is the consumer signaling. And so that article was basically saying, your leftism is basically determined by which podcast you listen to, and therefore curating your podcast is very important is an important political act because of its reflection of you individually.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. I started podcasting well before you did. I believe I started in 2009, and back then, to be a leftist podcaster, the socialist podcaster, meant that you were either talking to people who were a part of some sectarian Marxist group, like some Trot group or communist group, or you just weren't talking to anybody on the left. Like I started out by getting myself onto podcasts that were like focused on psychedelics because I felt like Marxism and socialism were about as far out as psychedelics at that moment.
Right.
So might as well bring it to these people who could possibly have the imagination to listen. And also, I was from the 90s in the Pacific Northwest, so I knew a little bit about like McKenna and Leary and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
And then it was around 2016, after I started working at Zero, that my little podcast got to be a little bit bigger. Got a somewhat larger audience, but I never felt this pressure to become the kind of political pundit that people would identify with as defining their politics. I always wanted it to be like a little broader view of the left. I mean, because here's two things I wanted. Either everyone should listen, and regardless of where they were on the left, or ultimately everyone should just believe exactly what I believed in whatever that moment was, the sect of one. But since then, Trump is gone, Sanders is kind of gone, and I feel like I've returned to 2009 in a way, just sort of talking to whoever I can. There are more podcasts around, but it seems like it's the same kind of endeavor where you're trying to create something rather than entering into a field that's already got a direction. Do you feel something similar for yourself, or do you feel really constrained by this notion that you have to fit into a slot that's already been constructed?
I think over since the end of the Sanders campaign, I think every left, God, I hate the word, but it's accurate, content creator has been challenged with how to integrate the reality of the irrelevance, basically, of the left as it's self-conceived online to the political process. And in some respects, it's very terrifying because it means that political project you thought you were part of is not actually really happening. But it's also kind of liberating because it does sort of take a little bit of the pressure off and allows you to refocus on the fact that at the end of the day, this is an entertainment product, and that if you're going to do politics, it can't be what counts for that. And that was something that we insisted on early on when the show started, but that, as the sort of the mirage of the Sanders campaign came into focus, it was very easy to imagine yourself part of an actual political movement with real ability to influence things. And that came with it a real, sense of responsibility and anxiety, honestly, that, was totally worth it because you felt like your words had this power. But now I feel like everybody has to come to terms with their relevance one way or the other. And yeah, so now the question is, how do you stay entertaining and truthful without feeding the delusions of people who want to still think that that they're building something when they go online to communicate their politics?
Well, I'm thinking about the sectarian left in relationship to this because, let's say certainly after 1989, but really before then, probably, after 68, say, there was a feeling on the left of defeat, like a deep defeat. And these sectarian groups, whether they were Trotskyist or Maoist or whatever flavor of Marxism or anarchism that they were, they continued on with not saying to themselves, well, we're no longer political, but saying something like, okay, our job now is to educate, propagandize, and retain the vision. Do you feel like maybe you have something like that responsibility to put a message into the bottle for the future, as Adorno would put it, or something
Yeah,
like that?
I mean, I've talked about that with friends that is how it feels. I mean, I know that I personally have found myself very incapable of uh, feeling like I'm offering anything constructive in analyzing the current political moment or certainly projecting it forward. So I'm finding myself much more focused on history and on trying to find something about the past that can be investigated in its totality due to the fact that it is past, and to tease out dynamics within it that can be applied to the current moment. And that's how I personally have been uh, dealing with the sort of the breakup and the decline of the political movement that I imagine myself part of.
So how old were you in 2011? Just
I was
when
about
when
30.
Occupy, you're about 30. So were you part of
I
that?
was there. I went down like the second day I was in New York, and I went down to the second day to Zuccotti Park, and I saw them do the General Assembly. I saw them do the twinkle hands. There were a bunch of topless women there with paint on them,
Mm-hmm.
and I remember just feeling a despair because it felt like a sort of a self-conscious 60s retread, and I couldn't imagine it having any real influence. And I left, and I was totally shocked by its persistence and how it grew. And I went back several times, but I never felt like I could contribute.
Yeah. I was part of the peace movement in the early 2000s. I organized and did marches, and one of the things that struck me then, even after 9/11, was that the left's response was right out of the 70s or even late 60s. It felt like we should all be high and not shave our arm, if you're a woman, not shave your armpits, and certainly not if you're a man, and just very much like it was a repeat. And I did end up leaving, but with Occupy, because it was focused on class and on the financial sector, and wasn't just about kind of emoting about the necessity for peace and against violence, or emoting about overcoming racism, or emoting about whatever it would be the issue of the day was, but actually trying to strike at the foundation a bit. At least that was the general aim. I felt pretty optimistic about Occupy, despite how carnivalesque it was, and how much it did have the aesthetic of the 60s. But then what struck me about it was not how long it lasted, but how it failed to deal with its own defeat.
Mm-hmm.
How long after people were still insisting that it was happening,
Yeah,
even after they'd all been driven out of the park, and how retreats into basically reformist kind of legal maneuvering and helping organizations that helping people stay in their homes was what they did. And so we're going to go
right.
to community organizing.
Yeah,
How that wasn't addressed as a retreat. It was thought of as like an advance of what we're doing next. And of
right.
course, it was just a way for everything to for the activists to become activists, professionalize, and then the rest just to kind of disperse.
Yeah,
But and I guess after with Bernie Sanders to kind of, it seemed like a lot of people when Sanders was running were preparing to have positions of power and authority within the new universe, within the White House, or within the new media space that was being developed. There was talk of it even on mainstream channels, and
yeah,
that's really different from how Occupy felt.
yeah,
Occupy felt like it was from the outside, and there was a defined radical left that was attempting something, whereas with the Sanders campaign, it was from the inside of the Democratic Party, and it was a struggle that was inside of it, and there was a new direction that might have been emerging within the Democratic Party. So that made it seem more realistic. but I think the people who got defeated there got defeated on a much more direct and personal level too. Like if Michael Brooks was still alive, I'm sure the level of disappointment would be intense right now.
Yeah.
So I don't know where I'm going. I'm just sort of talking. You can respond.
Right. No, I think that state, those like Occupy then Sanders, I don't think it could have really gone any other way, because I mean the left by that point and by the early aughts had been completely routed and destroyed. The working class base of the Democratic Party had been completely scattered. All you had really were individuals, people from all walks of life and all class backgrounds, responding to the crisis of the non-recovery after 2008 with a relatively spontaneous desire to express some resistance to the system as it existed, and because of the failure of the institutional left, I think that they were going to I think it's inevitable that they were going to be allergic to demands and to structured politics because they had seen it fail. Now, lack of that also failed, but it had to be experienced, before people could get over their allergy to those structures and accept that it really is all we have, because we simply don't have the capacity in the face of this totalizing capitalist system to defeat it by demonstrating an alternative, which will always just be nestled within the system and only be allowed to the degree that it is not a threat. So that, but that still didn't build a real constituency, and the Sanders campaign really was a mad dash for the controls. Famously, this Trump supporter wrote a infamous essay in 2016 where he compared the 2016 election to Flight 93 and how the Democrats are going to crash the plane into the White House or whatever, and that even though Trump is obviously a imperfect vessel, he's our only chance to grab the reins. That was much more, and of course, that's ridiculous. The actual policies pursued by both parties, as we've seen now, are basically identical. The Sanders campaign was a desperate grab for the top levels of power in order to build a working class movement that did not exist, which is inverting the process. But at this late date and with so few prospects on the ground, the only real option that felt available, it was the thing that was happening. And for a while, it did look like it was a going concern and that it had a chance. Now, I remember when it looked like Bernie might actually get the nomination, at least to us. I remember having to tell myself that I had to accept that I was not going to be able to treat a Sanders presidency like any previous one, and be critical of it, and provide and distance myself from it in office, even though it would immediately disappoint and immediately sell out in the ways that people were terrified of, and therefore, implicate me morally, which is what people were really scared of, is that they would lose their sense of political virtue by actually encountering power, and that it would probably fail in most of its objectives, but that failure was our only hope of building some capacity, some organizational energy that could withstand the continuing tightening of the neoliberal noose. So, like, even best case scenario, you're dealing with a desperate grab for not even really power, but for the hope of the ability to organize towards power, even beyond Sanders.
Yeah. Well, what I told myself was a different story. It was, well, I don't expect Sanders to actually be allowed to get the nomination. But I thought they might get to a contested convention in which they'd have to like pretty directly take it from him. Like he would have almost enough delegates to win, and then they would play games with super delegates to take it away from him. That's what I kind of figured would happen, and that it would do tremendous damage to the Democratic Party and disillusion many, many Democratic voters when that happened. And that, from my perspective, would be a great thing. To kill off the Democratic Party as any viable party for the left or for the working class.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, I was wrong as well. I mean, maybe fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your point of view, I was completely wrong. And I was surprised at how much solidarity there was amongst the candidates to defeat Sanders. I became a naive whiner when when that happened. When you were talking earlier, you said we can't create an alternative within this system that won't be nestled within it, and that's absolutely true. Like if you look at David Graeber's visions, like specifically of Occupy, the idea was to prefigure a new kind of politics and new kind of society, and by occupying these parks. That obviously won't work because of the very thing you pointed to. It has to be supported by this system. But the working class movements and unions or radical unions, that has a chance to be nestled deeply within capital, in fact, be the source of capital's value, and also to change and start to become a different kind of system. The degree to which the workers struggle for power politically and in the workplace. I mean, that's why Marx pointed to the proletariat as the revolutionary force, because it could do exactly that. It would be the source of power within capitalism that you couldn't get rid. They couldn't get rid of, and that then had the territory in which they could actually do political battle and change it.
Right.
So I just want to point that out.
Yeah.
So, what is it you think that is holding back the working class internationally and maybe in the United States from those kinds of political thoughts and attempts, and are they being held back? I mean, there's a great resignation. There are these anti-mandate protests. What are we to make of these things?
I think the thing holding back the working class is that there is no actual class experience in this country. Like the reality of class is obviously undeniable. The reality of your life being organized primarily and above all else by your relationship to capital. But in America, certainly most intensely, but other advanced nations certainly in a similar way, if less intensely, that subjective experience of class is been completely eradicated. People are not experiencing the hardship and the alienations of capitalism in crisis as members of a class. They're experiencing it as individuals, members of basically a consumer demographic tranche, and their relationship to each other is according to those demographic consumer models, and their hostility to the system and their resistance to it are also expressed according to that consumer identity. And that's not their fault. Like that's, I think, one of the big things that makes it very difficult to talk about this stuff in a way that's constructive is there is this smuggled in moralism that even people who consider themselves like hardcore materialist Marxists fall victim to, where the idea of like the working class as somehow like virtuous, as containing some transcendent values, as opposed to, the group who have the capacity to experience and express class consciousness in a way that can effectively challenge capitalism. But that's only in conditions where they are all experiencing alienation as members of a class. And that is certainly how Marx imagined the experience of being a working class person intensifying over time. But in the United States anyway, the process of the 20th century process of suburbanization and mass media have really turned us into I say, instead of the potatoes in the sack of rural France in the 19th century, the Pringles in the tube of American post-industrial society, where we are not workers. We work, but we are not workers. And that means that the organizing power of events that should be the first and most important element in building working class power does not have the effect of intensifying class consciousness, because there is none there to be intensified.
Yeah. I think there's this columnist named Thomas Friedman who used to always refer to little anecdotes that he picked up from his cab driver. So he would tell stories based on, what his cab driver would tell him. Well, I'm recently divorced. I'm dating through apps. So I'm turning into this guy who will always refer to a woman he met through Tinder as my version of the cab driver. So I had a short back and forth. I didn't even actually go on a date with a rural woman, lives out of town, who had a working class job in the service sector. Like, I'm going to, for the sake of anonymity, say she worked like as a manicurist. Wasn't quite what she did, and she was out of work. She was looking for a job. She had actually moved back to Oregon. She had she was a manicurist somewhere else. And we talked on the phone about this. And what she talked about was the people she knew who could help her find work. And those people included people who were starting manicure salons, starting these nail salons, as well as other workers. There was no distinction in her thinking, because it was just about finding work again. It wasn't about defining herself through what she consumed. It was about, she was still defined, like she repeated to me, like, I hate not having a job. I feel worthless, she was defined by her work. She had done it for a long time and actually felt good about it, and like it was a skill she had, and she was better than most. But she hated not being employed, and she also was very disdainful for people who would tell her, well, you could get food stamps, you can get unemployment. She's like, no, fuck that shit. I go to work. That's what I do. Right. So, but on the other hand, when I pointed out to her, like, with COVID and the inflation, and it's not your fault, this is happening across the board to a lot of people, her response was to say, yeah, no shit, Sherlock. What the fuck good does that do me for you to tell me that? Thank you, Professor. So literally, that's what she told me. And I guess what I'm getting at is, I think that the problem is actually maybe not just a matter of the consumer identity, but also just the fact that for a worker who's out of work, or who's struggling to get a higher wage, the institutions that they would maybe turn to aren't there.
Yeah.
Like, there was no way for her to work with other workers to collectively do shit.
Yeah.
But so she had to be kind of like an entrepreneur herself.
Yeah.
And she got a job within like 3 days later. She texted me like, oh yeah, I got hired. So.
Yeah. I mean, most people cannot afford to pine for political solutions to their economic problems, because in the meantime, they have to pay bills, and
Right.
they have to, just keep a roof over their head, and that privileges embracing grind set, embracing the idea that you really are on your own, and therefore political whining or pining or anything is only a waste of time that could be spent finding something through your own efforts, because the message that has been sent pretty loud and clearly over the past 10 years, certainly, from every institution in this country, is that you are completely on your own.
Yeah.
And that any political help is going to is a chimera, is a fantasy. It's a cynical fraud being dangled in front of you by people who really only want to pick your pocket. And it's very difficult to argue with people that that's not the case. And I feel like I do think that the thing that doomed the Sanders campaign was the success of the Obama campaign. I feel like Obama was the last person to get an honest hearing to pitch a political change to regular people. And the result of that was a complete betrayal that left people worse off than before, but now saddled with a bunch of cultural guilt because, well, the prospect of politics making anybody's life better is completely dismissed because we have to face the reality of life under capitalism. The need to express virtuous politics is more important than ever, even though it has no actual bearing on your life or material conditions. And so by the time Bernie shows up, he gets a great hearing among young people who were too young, for the most part, to have been disappointed by Obama. But everyone else who is not, ideologically committed to the Democratic or Republican parties, and maybe would definitely support in abstract a social democratic turn in American politics, has no faith in the program and no desire to be made a chump again.
Right. I would say that I think you're probably right, but I remember the Obama campaign pretty well. Of course, you do too. And during the nominating process, of the three candidates who had any shot, Obama was not the furthest to the left. That was John Edwards, who was talking about, two Americas, the rich and the poor, the working class and the ownership class. Edwards was the one who was more interested in revitalizing the working class part of the Democratic Party. And Obama, to me, seemed like, what did he have going as his left credentials? That he was black, I guess, but also that he hadn't been in office when the debacle.
Yeah, he didn't have a record. No, I mean it was all marketing. And in the primary, it was marketing that appealed to young people. And it had nothing to it, but the crisis, the economic crisis, happens just at the moment of the presidential election,
right,
when he's already the candidate.
They have to pause the campaign.
And
it's after he got the nomination.
Yes. So he, in that moment of crisis, got to stand in for this vague concept of change. And it didn't have a lot of ideological meat to it, but what does in a presidential election? I mean, these are branding exercises. And he was the brand of populist reform. No content, but just the brand of it. And populist reform turned out to be recapitalizing the banks, kicking millions of people out of their homes, and basically refusing to actually allow the economy to recover in any meaningful way.
And
for
continuing
regular
the Bush
people.
tax cuts.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. It's just there was very, very little difference between the two in terms of the major issue of the day.
Yeah.
Yeah. So listen, we've been talking for about 40 minutes. I want to keep you on for a little longer and do like a second half to squeeze money out of the people who are watching this, get them to go to Patreon and sign up to see the second half. Do you have another 35, 40 minutes to
Sure.
give? Okay. So we'll talk about the post left maybe in this section.
Oh boy.